Want to expand the reach of your content? Start a podcast. Feature industry experts on your show and leverage the influence and reach of your guests to grow your brand. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to the B2B Growth Show, a podcast dedicated to helping B2B executives achieve explosive growth. Whether you're looking for techniques and strategies or tools and resources, you've come to the right place. I'm James Carberry.
And I'm Jonathan Green.
Let's get into the show. Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. We are here today with Scott Wentworth. He's the founder at Wentworth Financial Communications. Scott, how you doing today?
Doing great, James. Thanks for having me on.
I'm really excited to chat with you today, Scott. We're going to be talking about turning data into thought leadership. And we've really got three specific mistakes that you see a lot of people making when it comes to trying to turn data into thought leadership. And I'm stoked to dive into those with you. But before we do, could you love for our listeners to have a little bit of context as to what you and your team are all about? Could you explain what Wentworth Financial Communications does and who you guys serve and all that good stuff?
Sure. We are a team of writers and editors based out of Chicago, serving clients around the country though. And we create white papers, newsletters, blogs, byline articles, and other forms of thought leadership, primarily for financial services companies. So asset management firms, investment banks, private equity, those types of firms. And really companies come to us because they are looking to articulate their expertise in some way, and they realize that that is their number one marketing and sales asset is the expertise of their people, but they're looking for ways to articulate that. So we're writers and editors. We've focused our careers on the financial services industry. So we partner with these firms to help them, like I said, create white papers and other forms of thought leadership to articulate that expertise.
So Scott, to dive right in here and talking about, this idea of turning data into thought leadership, when we were talking about it offline, you mentioned that there's a big, problem that we should address kind of from the onset of this before we get into these mistakes that people make. And the overriding problem is that it's hard to create a story around data, or people don't think to create a story around data. Can you talk to us about that for a little bit?
Yeah. So James, I think we're at a interesting stage in the marketing world, how for so long we were afraid of data and we didn't have it. And so we sort of pretended like we didn't need it and lived in this world of where numbers were a bad thing. We didn't want to attach data to our thought leadership and other marketing efforts. But now the pendulum has really swung where there's so much data available and data has become so trendy and so important that everyone's rushing to include as much data as possible in all of their marketing efforts. And so it's great that we have this data available, but to some degree, I've noticed in the last couple of years, it seems like the pendulum might have swung too far to the other side, where people have become so reliant on data or think that data is the end all of their thought leadership. And so it really manifests itself in a couple of ways, and we can get into those. But really, the issue I've seen is that it's good that we're, as marketers and B2B marketers, we are looking for ways to create hard data to validate these findings. However, we need to be smart about it and make sure that we're doing it in a way that doesn't neglect the storytelling and softer aspects of conveying that thought leadership.
Got it. Okay. So I want to dive into these three mistakes, Scott. This first one, you said the mistake that you see a lot of people making is that they turn on the data fire hose. Can you explain what you mean by that? Sure.
I think we've probably all signed up for or have experiences where we look in our inbox and we get an email from some organization that announces just released our 2017 annual survey of 10,000 practitioners in whatever market it is. And so then we download it. It sounds interesting. And we open it up and it's like an 80-page PDF or ebook where they list 500 questions or something ridiculous about all these different ways to answer sort of the same question. And so I say that, that's an example of how marketers will just turn on the data fire hose and they think that, well, just because we have this data, we've collected it, that we need to share it. My background is as a journalist, and I remember in journalism school, one of the teachings that I learned that has always stuck with me is don't avoid the impulse to note dump. And what note dumping is where you feel like, oh, I've worked hard to gather this information and it's in my notebook. Well, I need to find a way to work it into the story just because I have it. And I feel like marketers fall into that trap in some ways where they feel like if we've collected this data, we might as well just include it because there might be someone out there who might be interested in that last piece of data. And I feel like the real solution here is for people to realize that less is more when it comes to including data in your thought leadership, because you have to realize that you have a finite amount of your readers' attention.
Yep.
And you don't want to, and you can't control what they're going to pay attention to or what's going to really strike them. But you want to direct them toward the things that are the most valuable. And so if you include 80 pages worth of survey results, but really only 5 of those are super valuable, there's a good chance they won't get to those 5, and so you want to do what you can to guide them toward the things that matter. And that means you have to be really rigorous in what you leave out. You hear musicians play that the most important thing is not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play. And that's the same way when it comes to writing. And when it comes to data, is what you leave out can be just as important as what you put in.
No, that's really, really good. So Scott, beyond, turning on the data fire hose, really controlling what data I guess when you're talking about turning on the data fire hose, you're talking about it more in the context of the data that you choose to distribute, or can it also be applied to the type of data that you're trying to collect? Is it always better to err on the side of trying to collect as much data as you can and then kind of filtering that out and only distributing the stuff that's really good, or should we be thinking about how we can control the input as well?
Yeah, we should be thinking about it at both ends. I was referring more specifically to what we decide to put out, but on the collection side, it matters as well, because obviously there's a transaction cost when you ask someone to fill out a survey or when you're conducting research. So whether you're just asking people to answer questions or you're actually doing the research yourself, there's a cost to that. And if you want to focus your efforts on the things that are going to generate the most information or the most valuable information, and so this being judicious about what's really going to matter, or not just collecting data for the sake of collecting it, I think is important at both ends.
I love it. So the second one, this mistake that you see people making, is burying the lead. Explain to us what this means.
Yeah, this is, again, me going back to my journalism roots, where if I said avoid note dumping is one of the biggest lessons I learned, the biggest lesson you learn as a journalist is to not bury the lead, or don't bury the thing that's the most important. And you see this a lot in my world, working with portfolio managers and bankers and more technical people and attorneys. And a lot of times they fail to appreciate that the reader isn't going to do a great job of gravitating toward the most important thing. So you have to really make it front and center of what really matters. And what I tell my clients is that the fact that you have groundbreaking data, or in your mind that it's groundbreaking data, your audience doesn't really care about the fact that you have data. And they care a little bit about what that data says and what the findings are, but they don't totally care about that. What they really care about is how that data can help them make better decisions. And that's the lead, really. It's not the fact that you have this data or found something. The lead, the thing that that's going to grab the reader's attention, is what does this data mean for them and how does it help them make better decisions? And so you need to connect those dots. And that's the most important thing. So that's what you should lead with. I think we've all gotten the example, again, where a company sends out its white paper, its survey, and the headline or the subject line is something about announcing XYZ firm's annual study or something like that. And that doesn't matter to anyone. The only people that matters to is the chief marketing officer who worked to get that out.
Yeah.
The audience, what they care about is what's in this information and how is it going to help me make a better decision. For example, if I go back to my world in financial services, if you've surveyed a bunch of business owners to find out what business sentiment is like, the lead isn't that you've got that information, or the lead isn't even that business sentiment or consumer confidence or business owner confidence is up 10%. The lead is because confidence is up 10%, businesses are looking to invest more, or they're looking to make these sorts of acquisitions, or they're looking to expand into these types of areas. That's what really matters. So that's what you should lead with. That should be the headline.
No, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. This last mistake that we're going to talk about, Scott, is, and something we alluded to earlier, but it's not creating a narrative around the data. Talk to us about this one.
Yeah. And so with this, a lot of people, data is so valuable, and I'm not trying to diminish the importance of data, but I feel like it's important to realize that we've started to rely so heavily on data that we think the data is the story, or we think that including data and storytelling are mutually exclusive things. And as a result, data gets presented in a way that isn't as compelling or interesting or thought-provoking as it could be. And so what I really encourage people to do is to incorporate storytelling techniques along with their data. Because a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that these two things are mutually exclusive. What I mean by that is, all right, we'll put out one report where it's just all the data that we have around the subject. And then if we want to get anecdotal, maybe we'll create a separate case study where we give one example of how this trend is playing out. And really those two things I think should be combined, because that's what's going to be interesting and memorable for the reader. And so it really comes back to an understanding that data by itself isn't interesting. And so you have to create some context and some history around that data. And I'll give you an example of a client I worked with. It's an alternative asset manager, and they were writing a white paper about trends in the U.S. residential mortgage market or investments around those things. And there's plenty of data supporting the idea of why investing in mortgages is compelling now. However, what's really interesting is this idea that the reason that those investment opportunities exist is because there's been this overreaction by banks to the lending standards in the wake of the financial crisis. And so if we just wrote a piece that looked at, here's the current opportunity set in investing in U.S. mortgages, that wouldn't be very interesting. However, when you couple it with the backdrop of here's how we got here, here's how people were processing these regulations, how is it playing out with homeowners, that sort of thing, that really creates the context and creates this sense of conflict of here's how we got here and here's where we're going. And so what I remind people is that don't be afraid to get very granular and specific in using anecdotes within your data and thought leadership, because anecdotes are what make these ideas tangible. And people remember stories. They don't remember trends or data. And so you want to make this information memorable and compelling and tangible. And anecdotes and case studies are a great way to do that. So don't consider those to be separate entities. Really integrate those with your data and thought leadership efforts.
Yeah. And an example that you and I were talking about offline, and I actually mentioned Chris in another episode that I did earlier this week, actually, but his name's Chris Orlob. He's the senior director of product marketing at Gong.io, and a recent article that he wrote was titled "Women Break the Rules of Selling, Yet Still Outperform Men." And basically, Gong, the product, allows you to collect data on the sales conversations that your sales team is having. And so they're taking the data from their own product, and they told a really compelling story with the data by looking at sales calls from women and sales calls from men, the different things that they do differently, women breaking a lot of the, stereotypical protocol for how a sales call should go, yet they still outperform men. And so, just really, they obviously, they're a little different in that they're collecting the data from their own product. But I think the way that Chris is telling that story with the data is so compelling, and I think it speaks to what you were just talking about.
You're right. And it also speaks to this idea of don't bury the lead, because the lead there isn't that they have this data about how women perform versus men, or data on what trends or work or what format or order works the best when it comes to selling. The lead there is that there's this conflict between what we assume would be the case, because what the data tells us turns out isn't the case in actuality. And that conflict there that's the story. That's what's interesting to readers.
Yep. No. So Scott, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing this with us. If there's somebody listening, they want to stay connected with you, or they want to learn more about Wentworth Financial Communications, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Yeah, a great way is LinkedIn. I'm on there quite a bit, so you can find me under Scott Wentworth there. Also, my email address, scott@wentworthwriting.com. And then also I've created a landing page where I pulled together some blog posts and ebooks that we've written about related to how to turn data into thought leadership. It's more geared toward financial services. However, a lot of these lessons would be applicable for any professional services field. And the website for that, or the URL for that, is info.wentworthwriting.com/B2B growth. Again, info.wentworthwriting.com/B2B growth. So then you go there and get some of those materials, and like I said, I'm on LinkedIn, email. It's a great way to reach me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time. This has been really, really valuable. So I appreciate it, man.
Thanks a lot, James.
To ensure that you never miss an episode of the B2B Growth Show, subscribe to the show in iTunes or your favorite podcast player. This guarantees that every episode will get delivered directly to your device.
If you'd like to connect with B2B executives from all over the world, make sure to join our private Facebook community. There are some incredible conversations happening inside this group. To join, visit b2bgrowthshow.com/FB.
Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.